In the UFC, there's an unwritten rule that every fighter learns fast. You do things their way, or you don't do them at all. Skip a mandatory press conference, you get pulled from the card. Demand too much money, you sit at home. Make the organization look bad, and suddenly your ranking disappears and your phone stops ringing. The UFC has been enforcing that rule for over 30 years, and it has worked on virtually every fighter who ever stepped into that octagon. Virtually every fighter except one. Conor McGregor skipped press conferences, announced his own retirement on Twitter, demanded ownership of the company, negotiated a boxing match with the highest-paid athlete in combat sports while still under exclusive contract, and publicly declared his UFC deal void on election. And instead of being punished, instead of being blacklisted or buried on prelim cards, or quietly faded out, he became the most powerful fighter in the history of the sport. So the question worth asking is how? How does one man walk into a system specifically designed to keep fighters dependent and controllable, break every rule that system runs on, and come out the other side with more leverage than the organization itself? The answer starts a long way from Las Vegas. In a cold Dublin suburb, at 5 in the morning, Conor McGregor was waking up before dawn to commute 2.5 hours each way, to work construction sites as a plumber's apprentice. The work was cold, damp, and repetitive. The commute ate up 5 hours of every day. He lasted 18 months before he stopped showing up, just stopped going, didn't get out of bed. His father would come into his room and try to drag him up, and they'd fight, and then they'd stop talking for days. His parents expected him to finish the apprenticeship, build something stable, and settle into a normal life. Instead, he sat his father down and told him he was going to be a millionaire by 20. His father laughed. His son was 19 years old, had no professional fighting experience, no income, no sponsors, and no plan beyond a vague conviction that he was better than everyone else. Ireland wasn't exactly producing UFC champions at the time. The sport barely existed there, so McGregor went on government welfare and started training at Straight Blast Gym under John Kavanagh, Ireland's first ever BJJ black belt. Their relationship almost ended in the first week. During a sparring session, McGregor dropped a male training partner and then went too hard against a female teammate, putting her on the ground in tears. Kavanagh stepped in, put gloves on, and beat the hell out of him. McGregor's response was to show up the next day ready to train properly. He knew he'd deserved it. That combination of arrogance and the willingness to take a beating and learn from it without losing the belief that he was destined for something bigger, but became the foundation of everything that followed. He started fighting in Cage Warriors, a regional European promotion where prize money was almost non-existent. He'd collect his welfare check, train multiple sessions a day, and when his girlfriend's car broke down in the parking lot one night, he just slept in it. The car was a beat-up Peugeot 206 with smoke coming out of the engine that shook down the road. In his head, he was cruising down the Las Vegas Strip in a Ferrari. He lost twice early on, both times by submission, both times exposing real weaknesses in his grappling. He kept fighting anyway. By December 2012, he'd put together an 8-fight win streak and became Cage Warriors' first ever simultaneous 2-division champion. He was still on welfare. He was still broke. But his father had stopped laughing and started telling taxi passengers about his son's $1 million left hook. Then the UFC called. It was April Fool's Day when the email arrived, which made him think someone had hacked the UFC's account and was winding him up. It wasn't a prank. On April 6, 2013, Conor McGregor stepped into the UFC for the first time in Stockholm and knocked down Marcus Brimage in 67 seconds. Dana White noticed immediately, and what struck him wasn't just the finish. It was the way McGregor walked into that octagon, completely relaxed, totally at home, like it was his 100th fight, not his first. The organization had seen plenty of talented fighters come through the door. They'd never seen one who could make people want to watch quite like this. Over the next 2 years, McGregor fought Max Holloway in Boston, Diego Brandao in Dublin, and Dustin Poirier in Las Vegas. Every single time, the energy in the building was different. When he fought in Boston, thousands of Irish-American fans packed the TD Garden, Irish flags everywhere, chanting before he'd even touched gloves. But what made him genuinely irreplaceable wasn't the sold-out arenas. It was the trash talk, and specifically, what the trash talk was worth. Every time McGregor did a press conference, he generated millions of dollars in free media coverage. Sports outlets picked it up, then mainstream outlets, then international press. The UFC was getting advertising they couldn't have bought. For most fighters, promoting the event was a job the organization had to spend heavily on. McGregor's mouth pretty much did it for them. He mocked opponents' legacies, their fighting styles, their families, their accents, their countries. He did it with a precision that made it obvious this wasn't random aggression. It was psychological warfare, carefully calibrated to destabilize whoever was standing across from him. And the most devastating example of that came at UFC 194, against a man who had not lost a fight in over a decade. Jose Aldo had defended the featherweight title 7 times. He was widely considered the greatest featherweight in UFC history, possibly the greatest pound-for-pound fighter on the planet. McGregor spent months before their fight not just talking but dismantling Aldo's mental composure piece by piece. He mocked his legacy. He invaded his home country's press conferences. He grabbed his belt during a face-off and walked around with it like it already belonged to him. By the time fight night arrived, Aldo came out of his corner emotional and aggressive, completely abandoning the patient, technical approach that had made him unbeatable for a decade. He lunged forward 13 seconds into the first round. McGregor timed it perfectly, dropped that left hand, and Aldo was unconscious before he hit the canvas. Fastest title fight finish in UFC history. McGregor had called the exact technique he'd use, had visualized it hundreds of times in training, had essentially rehearsed the ending of a fight that hadn't happened yet. The trash talk wasn't just entertainment. It was a weapon that won the fight before a single punch was thrown. The UFC had never seen anything like it. A fighter who could sell a fight better than the promotion itself, and then deliver a finish that justified every word of the hype. That kind of fighter only comes along once, and the organization knew it. But while everyone was focused on the knockouts and the press conferences and the sold-out arenas, McGregor was already building something most fighters never think about until it's too late. In July 2014, before he'd even headlined a major UFC card, McGregor incorporated McGregor Sports and Entertainment Limited in Dublin. In 2016, he filed trademarks for Conor McGregor, the Notorious, and the Mac Life. Most fighters don't own their own names. They sign contracts that hand over image rights and don't think twice about it, which means they can't control how their face gets used, who profits from their merchandise, or what narrative gets told about them. McGregor locked down his intellectual property before anyone outside his circle understood how valuable it was going to become. He wasn't thinking like a fighter trying to win belts. He was thinking like a brand trying to scale. The image came first. Almost every press conference, every wine-in, every public appearance, McGregor showed up in custom-tailored suits. Not off-the-rack clothing. Gucci, Dolce & Gabbana, luxury watches worth more than most fighters made in a year. One suit had pinstripes that, up close through a magnifying glass, read a very specific expletive. He drove expensive cars, posted from private jets, surrounded himself with green, gold, and Celtic imagery. To be a McGregor fan wasn't just to follow a fighter. It was to buy into a whole lifestyle, and it worked on a scale that was hard to comprehend. By 2020, McGregor had over 33 million Instagram followers. Today, he's approaching 50 million, nearly as many as the UFC's official account. Jon Jones, widely considered the greatest fighter who ever lived, has around 10 million. That gap mattered because it flipped the traditional relationship between athletes and sponsors. Normally, a brand lends credibility to a fighter. You wear Nike, and Nike's status transfers to you. McGregor reversed it. Brands started borrowing status from him, which meant they needed him more than he needed them. He launched the Mac Life as his own media production company, giving him direct access to his audience with no UFC gatekeepers filtering the message. He launched August McGregor, a fashion brand. In 2017, he had complete control over his image, his merchandise, and his narrative. GSP, Anderson Silva, Jon Jones, all phenomenal athletes who stayed within the system, let the UFC control their story and build careers inside the machine. McGregor built his own machine, and when sponsors or media wanted access, they had to go through his company and play by his rules. Then came UFC 205, Madison Square Garden. McGregor knocked out Eddie Alvarez in the second round and became the first fighter in history to hold 2 UFC titles simultaneously. When he grabbed the microphone afterward, he looked at the crowd and said he'd spent a lot of time slaying everyone in the company, that he'd ridiculed everyone on the roster, and that he'd like to take this opportunity to apologize to absolutely nobody. The crowd went insane. From that moment on, he was so valuable that the UFC genuinely could not afford to lose him. And it was right after that night that he made the first move the organization never saw coming. He asked for ownership, straight up, said he wanted equity, an equal share, what he'd earned. The UFC had just been sold to WME-IMG for $4 billion, and the new owners had let 23 celebrities buy small stakes for $250,000 each. Conan O'Brien owned a piece of the company. Mark Wahlberg owned a piece. Serena Williams owned a piece. McGregor had generated hundreds of millions in pay-per-view revenue and owned absolutely nothing. Dana White turned him down, not because the demand was unreasonable, but because granting it would set a precedent the organization couldn't afford. If McGregor got equity, other fighters would demand it. That opened the door to collective bargaining, unionization, and labor disputes the UFC had spent decades carefully avoiding. Fighters were classified as independent contractors with no union and no collective power. One ownership stake could destabilize the entire structure. So the answer was no, and for most fighters, that would have been the end of the conversation. McGregor did not end the conversation. He escalated it. In April 2016, the UFC announced he'd headline UFC 200, the biggest card of the year, against Nate Diaz in a rematch. Then McGregor refused to fly to Las Vegas for the mandatory press conference, saying he needed to stay in Iceland and focus on training. The UFC pulled him from the card. Dana White said no fighter was bigger than the promotion. McGregor responded by announcing his retirement on Twitter. The tweet went viral, reached millions of people, and generated more media coverage than any official UFC statement could have bought. Before long, the organization reversed course and put him back on a different card. He had tested the machine and discovered that the UFC needed him more than he needed them. The retirement tweet wasn't a tantrum, it was a negotiating tactic, and it worked. But what changed everything, what gave him leverage no UFC fighter had ever possessed before, was a boxing match that Dana White called impossible. McGregor was under exclusive contract. The UFC had the legal power to block him from fighting anywhere else. He negotiated directly with Floyd Mayweather anyway, partnered with Showtime and CBS, and forced the organization into a corner. They could either sue their biggest star and create a public relations catastrophe, or take a cut of the revenue and let it happen. They took the money. On August 26, 2017, McGregor stepped into the boxing ring at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas. The fight sold 4.3 million domestic pay-per-view buys and an estimated 6.7 million globally, the second highest total in combat sports history. Total revenue reached around $700 million. McGregor's personal earnings were estimated between $85 and $130 million. In one single night, he made what would have taken years of UFC fighting to accumulate, but the real shift wasn't the money. It was what the fight proved. The world tour, the press conferences, the trash talk on a global stage, the sold-out arenas across multiple continents, all of it demonstrated that McGregor could carry an event of that magnitude without the UFC's brand attached to it at all. He didn't need their promotional machine. He didn't need their infrastructure. He didn't need their platform. He had his own, and it was bigger. After Mayweather, the UFC couldn't treat him like a standard fighter anymore. Boxing promoters would pay him 9 figures for a single night. The standard UFC compensation structure looked absurd by comparison, and McGregor had what's known in business as foo money, which meant the organization had lost the one thing that had always kept fighters in line, their financial dependency on the payday. When he returned to the octagon, he came back as something new, not an employee with a contract, a businessman who happened to fight occasionally. In September 2018, he signed a new 6-fight deal structured to make him the highest-paid fighter in the sport. When he fought Khabib at UFC 229 a month later, his disclosed purse was $3 million. His actual estimated earnings were around $50 million. The difference revealed how completely the compensation model had been restructured. Most UFC fighters don't get pay-per-view points at all. The ones who do get $1 to $2 per buy. McGregor was getting 3 to 5, double or triple what other top draws earned from the same event. He also had input on matchmaking, a level of control that essentially didn't exist for other fighters. And, in an arrangement that had never happened before in UFC history, his whiskey brand Proper No. 12 became an official UFC sponsor, with his label appearing on the octagon canvas during his fights. The organization was now advertising his business alongside their own. He got revenue sharing, matchmaking influence, brand integration, and the ability to disappear for years without losing his status in the sport. Most fighters lose their rankings and their relevance after being inactive for 18 months. McGregor went away from 2016 to 2018 for the Mayweather fight, then again from 2021 to 2024 after breaking his leg, and came back both times as the biggest draw in the sport. Everything except the ownership stake he'd demanded. Dana White had given him everything around ownership without giving him ownership itself, and McGregor had decided that if the UFC wouldn't let him in as a partner, he'd build something they couldn't touch. Right after UFC 205, he'd launched the Mac Life. In 2017, August McGregor, but the move that dwarfed everything else came in September 2018, timed almost exactly to his UFC return. He launched Proper No. 12 Irish whiskey. The timing wasn't accidental. The brand sold 2.4 million bottles in its first 6 months. First-year revenue hit $1 billion. It became the second largest Irish whiskey in the United States, right behind Jameson. In April 2021, McGregor sold the majority stake to Proximo Spirits for around $600 million. His personal cut was estimated at approximately $130 million. From one business venture, he'd made almost as much as the 10 highest-paid UFC fighters in history, combined across all their fights. He then launched McGregor Fast, a fitness app generating around $5 million a year in recurring subscription revenue. The whiskey sold whether he fought or not. The fashion line moved product whether he trained or not. The app kept pulling subscriptions whether he was in the octagon or sitting on a yacht somewhere. He had built income streams that had nothing to do with the UFC and everything to do with the brand. He'd been quietly assembling since before most fans knew his name. And then, in 2024, he made the move that scratched the ownership itch in a way the UFC had never anticipated. He announced an ownership stake in the Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship, a competing combat sports organization. While still under contract with the UFC, he hadn't been able to own a piece of the sport's biggest organization. So he became an owner somewhere else, in a promotion that was growing fast and had no interest in keeping fighters dependent. The UFC's refusal to grant him equity 8 years earlier had seemed like smart business at the time. In hindsight, It pushed him to build a power structure that existed entirely outside their control. Then came January 2026, and a deal that changed everything again. The UFC signed a massive new agreement with Paramount that eliminated pay-per-view entirely. Every event would now stream on Paramount Plus with no additional charge to subscribers. For the organization, it was a financial windfall. Over $1 billion in guaranteed annual revenue, predictable, stable, and not dependent on individual fighters driving pay-per-view buys. For McGregor, it was a direct attack on the compensation structure that had made his UFC deals worth anything. His entire contract had been built around pay-per-view points. At UFC 229 against Khabib, the reason his earnings reached an estimated $50 million was because of his cut of those 2.4 million buys. With pay-per-view gone, that revenue stream was gone with it. McGregor went on a live stream and declared his contract void, said it publicly, without waiting for a press release or a negotiating back. His deal had been structured around pay-per-view sales. Pay-per-view no longer existed. He needed a new contract. Other top fighters, including Alexander Volkanovski, admitted publicly they had no idea how the UFC planned to compensate them for the eliminated pay-per-view points. They were confused and waiting for answers. McGregor wasn't waiting. He was demanding a complete renegotiation, and he had a decade's worth of leverage sitting behind that demand. A whiskey empire worth hundreds of millions. Equity in a rival promotion. 50 million social media followers. A brand that sponsors and media outlets needed access to, on his terms. The UFC could either meet his demands or watch their biggest commercial draw walk away permanently, knowing he had the financial independence to make that threat real. This is the culmination of everything he built from the moment he stopped showing up to construction sites and told his laughing father he'd be a millionaire by the organizations, the trademarks, the social media empire, the fashion line, the whiskey, the fitness app, the rival promotion ownership, the restructured contracts, the staged retirements. The boxing match, they said, was impossible. None of it was random. Every move added leverage. Every asset made him less dependent. Every refusal from the UFC became fuel for something built outside their walls. Most fighters come into the sport, hoping to win belts and earn enough to be comfortable. McGregor came in and quietly rebuilt the power structure around himself until the sport needed him more than he needed it. He didn't break the UFC's business model by being the best fighter. There have been better fighters. He broke it by understanding something none of them did. That in any business, the person with the most options has the most power. And from a broken-down Peugeot in a Dublin parking lot to a $200 million empire and a contract dispute that has the world's biggest combat sports organization scrambling, Conor McGregor made sure he always had more options than anyone else in the room.